Catoro fino mai.
The Philistines are a bit of an enigma. There are quite a few rather important things about them that are uncertain, like who they were and where they came from and why they came. They just explode into the Middle East around about 1250, 1240 BC, laying waste to all around them. Practically the only written sources we have are found in the Bible and also in Egyptian records. According to the Egyptians, the Philistines were one of a number of seafaring groups that raided the coastal areas of the Middle East about this time period. They describe these raiders as a tight tribal confederation, like a huge alliance. And although the exact extent of this association is open to some doubt, they do indeed seem to have coordinated their movements. They're commonly referred to today as the Sea Peoples, a strange nebulous kind of term, thought up by a French Egyptologist called de Rouge in 1855. The people at the time did not use the term the Sea Peoples. The Egyptians list several of the tribes that make up the Sea Peoples, but unfortunately the only one that can be positively identified is a group called the Lucca, a very well-known piratical people hailing from western Anatolia, that is the southwest corner of what is now Turkey. There's another tribe called the Sherden, who are supposed to be associated with Sardinia and Sicily. There's another one called the Weshesh, who knows where they came from. And then there is the Peliset, the Egyptian name for the Philistines. Together with the Libyan tribes, the Peliset launched not one but two full-scale invasions of Egypt sometime between 1240 and 1200. The Egyptians very heroically managed to fight them off. Quite a lot of cost and quite a lot of damage, but they do beat them off. The Peliset next turn up in Palestine, quite literally Palestine. Palestine means land of the Philistines, land of the Peliset. Very possibly deported there by the Egyptians. A bit uncertain about that. It is a characteristic of successful empires, and the Egyptians were a very successful empire, that they incorporate defeated enemies into their own armies. Palestine, the area of Palestine, was under Egyptian control at this time, but their rule was failing. So using the Philistines to secure the area for them from far worse enemies would have been a logical move to make. Of course, that is conjecture. The exact order of these events is uncertain. It is quite possible the Philistines could have occupied Palestine first and then attacked Egypt from there. Whichever, once in Palestine, the Philistines settled the 5 cities of the Philistines: Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gaza and Gath, and sparred with their neighbours, Canaanites, Israelites, Edomites, Assyrians. When they weren't doing that, they fought each other. They were a very virile and adventurous culture, much in demand as mercenaries. It's not immediately apparent from reading the Bible, but close examination shows that a good chunk of King David's army were Philistines. Now, the Bible always refers to the Philistines as the uncircumcised Philistines, or those uncircumcised fellows. Circumcision is not unique to the Jewish people, but it is a characteristic of Semitic people. In other words, emphasising they were uncircumcised is a way of saying the Philistines were not Semitic, which fits in well with the Egyptian assertion that they came from the sea. Modern DNA analysis on various graves found in the Philistine cities indicates they had a southern European origin, which didn't really surprise anybody. I mean, after all, if you're not native to the area, you are part of something called the Sea Peoples, and it's before the era of ocean-going travel. Where else are you going to come from but southern Europe? The Bible agrees with this. It says in several times that the Philistines came from Kafta, that is, Crete. The general consensus of archaeologists and historians now is that they originated from the coastal areas and islands of what is now southern Greece, including all those little islands in the Ionian Sea, maybe arriving in Palestine via Crete, which is why the Bible says from Crete. Certainly a great many of their artefacts, jewellery, pottery and so on, has a very Mycenaean Greek look to it. In fact, when it was dug up in Ekron and it was thought originally to have been imported, it was only after a very close examination of the materials that they used that they realised it had been locally manufactured. The important point to bear in mind for biblical scholars is that the Philistines may have lived in Canaan. They were generally enemies of Israel, but they were not Canaanites. They are not Canaanites. They were new arrivals in the area, actually post-dating the arrival of the people of Israel. The DNA evidence suggests they intermingled with the local population very freely and very quickly, and within a couple of generations the actual genetic inheritance of the Philistines was pretty much gone. However, culturally they remained distinct for several centuries. They were the dominant military and political power in the area for about 150 years, and seem to have only been superseded by the growth of the Kingdom of Israel. They persisted as a regional power during the period of the Israeli Kingdom, and they also following its collapse until they were finally conquered by the Assyrians. They became a client kingdom until they finally disappeared from history after being conquered by the Babylonians in the 8th century BC. That's not to say they got wiped out, it's just simply that they merged with the other peoples in the area and lost their cultural distinctiveness. So this success is hard to justify from a look at their army, which is what we have a look at now. It's a very pedestrian kind of force. This particular one is a very early Philistine army, one of the ones that fought against the Egyptians. Later Philistine forces would have been a bit more varied, they would have had chariots and so on. But initially, Philistine forces just consisted of a load of men on foot, armed with a spear, a sword, shield, and that is really about it. Some had breastplates made out of layers of hardened leather or bronze, but that was really just for the lucky or the few or the rich. They didn't use slings. Slings are weapons of the highlands, and the Philistines were coastal and island people. That may partly explain why Goliath, in the famous fight between Goliath and David, was so disparaging about the slings. Being unfamiliar with it, they wouldn't have realised just how powerful they were. They don't even seem to have developed the bow either. That's not as big a disadvantage as it may seem. Bows at the time were very low powered and short ranged, and not as commonly effective as we think of, because we've been raised on stories of Agincourt and Robin Hood and things like that. These are much low power bows. So how do we explain their remarkable military achievements? Well, a lot of it is down to timing. The arrival of the Philistines coincides with the end of the Bronze Age and the start of the early Iron Age, when people stopped using bronze as the main metal of choice and started using iron. It used to be thought the reason for the success of the Philistines came down to them having access to Iron Age technology, specifically Iron Age weaponry, while their opponents and rivals did not. That would make a lot of sense. If you have an iron sword and you hit a bronze shield or bronze armour, it's just going to go straight through it, iron being a lot stronger and a lot harder than bronze, and you can make edges and points much sharper with it as well. Unfortunately for the theory, archaeological evidence makes it quite clear that the Philistines did not have a technological edge over their neighbours. The Bible also confirms this. If you again look at the famous fight between David and Goliath, Goliath is described as having an iron-tipped spear like a weaver's beam. That is very big, but he has a bronze helmet, bronze mail, bronze greaves, bronze javelin. In other words, mixed technology. All the evidence suggests that iron, although around at this time, was very, very rare and restricted to kings, heroes and champions, and not much of that. In fact, the very first iron artefacts were jewellery. It was so valuable it was used for personal adornment. There is an alternate theory. The start of the 12th century BC, when all this is happening, is also the time of the Great Bronze Age collapse. Now, this is an event that is well known to historians and archaeologists, but it doesn't impinge on the worldview of most of the general public. Essentially, the Bronze Age collapse was a Middle Eastern equivalent of the Dark Ages. Many of the old empires, like the Hittites and the Mitanni, ceased to be. Others, like the Assyrians and the Babylonians, contracted very sharply. A lot of the cities in the north and east of the Middle East were destroyed, often violently, and then abandoned, usually permanently. There was a massive decrease in population generally, massive decline in literacy levels, major disruption of trade routes. The only empire that emerged relatively unscathed, and it's only relatively unscathed, was the Egyptians, which is why we have Egyptian records of the time. They're the only ones ever writing things down, undertaking any kind of building project. It used to be thought that the Sea Peoples in general, and the Philistines in particular, were the main causes of the Bronze Age collapse. It is now generally thought there was actually a multiplicity of factors. It's known there were a lot of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions up to the north, which was causing a lot of disruption, a lot of movement of people fleeing the area, which was pressing in on other peoples. We know the transition to iron technology was affecting trade routes and various existing social structures. Bronze had been the most important metal for a long time, and now all of a sudden all the trade routes for that were disrupted. It's also known that in the period just before the Bronze Age collapse, there were several periods of severe drought, which would have caused famine and resultant widespread economic and social unrest. It may be that rather than causing the collapse, the Sea Peoples just simply took advantage of existing stresses in the old empires. They were already beginning to, fall down, and the Sea People just took advantage of it, and thereby either tipped them over the edge or made the collapse much worse. There only remains the use of Philistine as a derogatory term to describe somebody who is very materialistic or anti-intellectual or unappreciative of beauty or art. It's a fairly modern development. It came into use basically from Germany, from the town of Jena. There was a university there, and as is usual in many of these places, there was a typical town versus gown situation in which the students got into quite a severe fight with the local townspeople. Several people were killed, and as a result of this, the university's ecclesiastical superintendent, a man called Goetze, gave this huge, rather fire and brimstone sermon after this fight had taken place, in which he condemned the townspeople very roundly, referring to them as Philistines, Philister, people who were just very anti-intellectual by definition because they were fighting against university students. The term stuck. Transported into English, it was in common use in English by the 1820s and has been ever since. There's in fact very little evidence that the Philistines were particularly uncultured. In fact, looking at some of their artifacts, the pottery, for example, is considerably better than anything the Canaanites and Israelites were making at the time. So it's not really very justified, but it is what it is. It's now it kind of seals the idea of the Philistines being the bad guys.
Katoro fido mai, ma